Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. I still wake up some nights thinking I can hear the rain. Not ordinary rain, but the kind that fell during those final days. The kind that carved through concrete like water through sand and stripped the bark from trees in minutes. But there's no rain anymore. There's no anything anymore, except this floating piece of debris I call home, and the endless black ocean that swallows the horizon in every direction. My name is Daniel Karr, and I'm telling you this story because someone needs to remember what happened when the world drowned. When I say drowned, I don't mean some gradual rise in sea levels or a particularly bad hurricane season. I mean drowned like a rat in a bathtub, deliberate and thorough by something that owned the water long before we ever crawled out of it. But before I tell you how it ended, let me tell you how it began. With a phone call I never made to a daughter who died screaming my name. It started on a Thursday evening in Baltimore, October 15th. I remember the date because it was Emma's birthday, and we had this standing tradition of birthday phone calls no matter what. She was 28 that day, working as a veterinarian in Denver, and she'd left 3 voicemails reminding me not to forget. The last one said, "Dad, you better call me at 8 or I'm driving to Baltimore to personally drag you out of that office." I was planning to call at exactly 8 o'clock. I even had a gift picked out, a first edition copy of All Creatures Great and Small that had cost me 2 weeks' salary. It was sitting on my desk next to the phone when the sky caught fire. At exactly 7:43 p.m, green and blue light erupted across the eastern horizon, like someone had cracked open the skull of God and let his dreams spill out. My office faced the Atlantic, and through my 20th floor window, I watched the evening sky turn into a canvas of colours that had no names in any human language. The light didn't just shine, it writhed, casting shadows that moved in directions that made my eyes water and my brain itch. Then came the sound that ended the world. I've tried to describe it to myself 1,000 times in the years since, but words were never built for something like that. It was the sound reality makes when it breaks. The scream of physics being violated. If you took every thunderclap that had ever existed and forced them through the throat of a creature the size of continents, you might come close. Every window in Baltimore exploded simultaneously, including mine. I watched the glass blow inward in slow motion, each shard catching the alien light and throwing it back like 1,000 tiny mirrors. My coffee mug didn't just fall off my desk, it vaporized against the wall as the entire building flexed like a tree in a hurricane. The earthquake registered as a 7.2, but I knew immediately this wasn't any earthquake that had ever happened before, because the ocean was screaming back. 200 miles east of Cape Cod, something the size of Manhattan had punched through the surface of the Atlantic Ocean like a fist through tissue paper. But this wasn't impact, it was emergence, something rising from depths that weren't supposed to exist, breaching the surface of our world like a whale, made of nightmares and mathematics. The shockwaves reached shore in minutes, but these weren't ordinary tsunami waves. They probed the coastline like fingers testing the strength of a lock, learning the shape of our defences before the real assault began. My phone rang before the building stopped shaking. Director Patricia Wells from FEMA headquarters. Her voice stretched so tight, I could hear it cracking. "Daniel, I need you in the emergency command center now. We're getting satellite imagery. that's making our best scientists question their sanity. I grabbed my jacket and ran for the stairs through corridors filled with broken glass and the sound of car alarms screaming 20 floors below. Every step took me further from that phone call, to Emma, further from the last normal moment I would ever have. The streets of Baltimore had become a symphony of chaos. Every car alarm in the city wailed in different keys, creating a dissonance that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Streetlights flickered in patterns that almost looked deliberate, as if the city's electrical grid was trying to communicate something urgent. Dogs howled from every direction, their voices weaving together into harmonies that raised every hair on my body. But it was the birds that told me we were truly doomed. Every winged creature in the city had taken flight simultaneously, forming clouds so dense they blotted out the stars. Seagulls, crows, pigeons, sparrows, hawks, even the ravens from Edgar Allan Poe's grave, all fleeing inland, with the desperate panic of creatures that sensed something their human neighbours couldn't yet comprehend. They moved like a living stormfront, their cries creating a wall of sound that seemed to push against the alien light on the horizon. The emergency command centre sat 3 stories underground, a concrete bunker designed to survive nuclear war. It wasn't designed for what was coming. By the time I arrived, the room buzzed with officials, scientists and military personnel, all staring at screens that showed impossible things. Tom Harrison, our chief meteorologist, grabbed me the moment I walked in. His face had gone the colour of old bone, and his hands shook as he pointed at the main display. "Daniel, thank Christ you're here. I need someone who understands water to tell me I'm not hallucinating." The satellite feed showed the Atlantic from space, and what I saw made my stomach disappear. The alien structure had created a perfect spiral crater in the seafloor, but the water around it defied every law of fluid dynamics I'd studied in 23 years as a hydrologist. Instead of flowing naturally to fill the crater, the ocean was moving in geometric patterns that looked like writing in a language built from currents and pressure. "Water doesn't behave like this," Tom whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. "It's forming mathematical sequences, Daniel. The ocean is doing mathematics." He switched cameras, showing me the structure itself for the first time. My mind simply refused to process what I was seeing. It wasn't built so much as grown, organic curves spiraling upward in defiance of physics and good taste. The surface pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that reminded me of deep-sea creatures, but these lights moved with purpose, sending signals in rhythms that matched no earthly heart. "Temperature readings?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "The water around the site has warmed 15 degrees in 2 hours. Not gradually, but in discrete jumps, as if something down there is adjusting a thermostat." Before I could respond, every alarm in the centre started screaming at once. Patricia Wells answered the hotline to the National Weather Service, and I watched her face drain of colour as she listened. "We have multiple Category 5 hurricanes forming over the crash site," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. 6 of them, arranged in a perfect hexagonal pattern. They appeared in the last 12 minutes with no atmospheric precursors. The main screen switched to weather radar, and I felt the universe tilt beneath my feet. 6 massive storm systems sat above the alien structure like a crown of thorns made from wind and fury. Each hurricane was perfectly formed, violently powerful, and positioned with geometric precision that no natural weather system had ever achieved. But they weren't alone. As we watched in paralyzed horror, smaller storms began forming between the giants, creating a web of interconnected weather that stretched from horizon to horizon. Lightning arced between the systems, not randomly, but in deliberate patterns that looked almost like, "It's a circuit," I whispered. "The storms are connected. It's building a circuit out of the atmosphere itself." The first reports from the coast confirmed my worst fears. Off Cape Cod, waves 400 feet tall moved in perfect formation like a fleet of liquid mountains. But these weren't random storm surge. The waves struck the coastline with surgical precision, targeting harbours, communication towers, and power plants as if guided by intelligence vast and patient. Within the hour, every whale within 100 miles of shore had beached itself. Not gradually, but all at once, as if they'd received a signal that overrode every instinct for survival. Dolphins raced toward the beaches in desperate pods, their sonar creating cacophonies of terror that shattered windows in coastal towns. But the migration of the birds was what broke my heart. Every species along the eastern seaboard abandoned territories they'd defended for generations, fleeing inland in massive flocks that darkened the sky. Somehow they knew what was coming before we did. The first video footage came from a Coast Guard helicopter that managed to get within visual range of Manhattan. What they filmed will haunt whatever dreams I have left until consciousness finally abandons this transformed body. The waves attacking New York weren't chaotic. They struck the city in sequence, each one testing a different approach like a chess master studying the board. The first wave engulfed the Statue of Liberty completely, holding it underwater for exactly 90 seconds before retreating. The second wave targeted the Brooklyn Bridge, flowing over and around the structure with curious, almost gentle motions. The third wave rose from the harbour like a liquid cathedral, towering over the tallest skyscrapers, and then it waited. For 37 seconds, it hung motionless above Manhattan, a mountain of dark water that pulsed with its own bioluminescent heartbeat. In that frozen moment, I realized we weren't watching a natural disaster. We were watching something learn. When the wave finally fell, Lower Manhattan simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed or damaged, but erased with the thoroughness of an artist painting over a mistake. Buildings, streets, subway systems, 15,000 people living their last ordinary moments, all swept away as if they had never drawn breath, or paid taxes, or fallen in love. When the water retreated, there was nothing but empty harbour, where some of the most expensive real estate in the world had stood for over a century. The wave had taken everything, right down to the bedrock, leaving a hole in reality that filled slowly with alien water that glowed with its own malevolent light. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered in the command center. "It's not just destroying, it's harvesting." They were right. Each subsequent wave was more efficient than the last, stripping away civilization with the methodical patience of something that measured time in geological epochs. Power plants disappeared first, then communication infrastructure, then the transportation networks that kept the city alive. By dawn, Manhattan was an island of ruins, surrounded by water that pulsed like the blood vessels of some vast, sleeping god. But New York was just the appetizer. Boston fell while I was trying to coordinate evacuation routes that no longer existed. The storm didn't bother with the pretense of natural weather patterns. Waves simply rose from Boston Harbor and began systematically disassembling the city, starting with the historical districts and working outward in concentric circles. Beacon Hill, Back Bay, the Freedom Trail, all erased with the casual efficiency of someone clearing cobwebs from a corner. Philadelphia lasted until noon on Friday. I watched satellite feeds as the Delaware River reversed its flow and began carrying the city of brotherly love away piece by piece. The Liberty Bell's final chime was broadcast live on CNN before the building housing it disappeared beneath water that moved with conscious intent. My Baltimore, held out until evening. From the command center, I could hear the harbor turning into a cauldron of black water that boiled with unnatural currents. The aquarium's dolphins had all fled inland that morning, abandoning their tanks to die on dry land, rather than remain in water that had been claimed by something ancient and hungry. By Saturday morning, Miami had ceased to exist in any form that satellite imagery could detect. 6 million people gone without a trace, as if South Florida had been nothing but a mirage that finally dissolved in the heat. The rain that began falling inland wasn't rain in any meteorological sense. Each droplet fell with ballistic precision, striking surfaces with enough force to bore perfect circular holes through concrete. I watched the parking lot outside our bunker turn into Swiss cheese in less than an hour, each raindrop carving a hole exactly 1 inch deep and perfectly round. Cars dissolved like sugar cubes. Trees lost their bark in geometric patterns that revealed wood sculpted into impossible curves. The rain wasn't just destroying, it was redesigning, reshaping the landscape according to aesthetic principles that human minds couldn't grasp. The flooding that followed moved at speeds that violated every law of hydraulics I'd ever learned. 60 miles per hour through Virginia, 70 through North Carolina, racing inland with the determination of water that knew exactly where it needed to go. It flowed uphill when necessary, defied gravity when convenient, and pursued an agenda we couldn't comprehend, but could feel in our bones. Government supercomputers worked around the clock, running every flood model and topographical survey in existence, desperately calculating where survivors might find temporary refuge. The answer, when it finally came, was a death sentence disguised as hope: Nebraska. The central plateau of Nebraska was the only landmass in the continental United States high enough and far enough from the coasts to potentially survive what was coming. Everything else would be underwater within a week. I found myself in a convoy on Interstate 70, what remained of it joining the largest migration in human history. Millions of vehicles stretched to every horizon, carrying everything they owned towards the promise of high ground in the American heartland. Luther Brandt was our convoy's anchor, a mountain of a man whose 18-wheeler had become an ark for 24 strangers he'd collected along the route. He'd been driving trucks for 30 years, knew every mile of highway from Maine to California, and his eyes held the hollow stare of someone watching his life's work disappear beneath alien water. Spent my whole life on these roads, he told me during a fuel stop in West Virginia, his voice roughened by 3 decades of diesel fumes and truck stop coffee. Know every exit, every rest stop, every place to get a decent meal between here and anywhere else. Now half of them are ocean floor, and the other half are turning into rivers that flow the wrong direction. Eleanor Ward had been living an ordinary life as a school principal in Baltimore when the storms came. She'd loaded 37 orphaned children onto a yellow school bus and driven west, singing songs and telling stories to keep them from understanding they were watching the world end through tinted windows. The children were her responsibility now. Kids whose parents had been claimed by waves or floods, or simply vanished in the chaos of civilization's collapse. Elena had no children of her own, but she'd become mother to the last fragments of an entire generation. I watched her brush tears from her eyes every night as she counted heads, making sure all 37 were still breathing. But it was Omar Dalen who carried the weight of terrible knowledge in his haunted eyes. The ex-Navy diver had been traveling alone when he joined our convoy outside Washington, D.C., his hands shaking whenever he looked towards the eastern horizon. He spoke little during the day, but at night, around campfires, built from the wreckage of the old world, he would stare into the flames and whisper things that made my blood freeze. "I've seen this before," he told me one night as we camped in the ruins of a Pennsylvania town whose name had been washed away by the rain. 5 years ago, deep sea dive near the Puerto Rico Trench. We were mapping the ocean floor for Chevron, looking for new drilling sites. He paused, his eyes reflecting more than just firelight. In those depths, I saw knowledge that no human being was meant to carry. We found cities, Daniel, structures that stretched for miles along the abyssal plains. towers that spiraled up from trenches so deep our equipment couldn't measure them, all covered in coral and sediment, like they'd been down there for millions of years, waiting. The hair on my arms stood up despite the warmth of the fire. Built by what? That's what we wondered. My partner Rodriguez, he was braver than me, took core samples from the structures themselves. When we got back to the surface, when the lab results came back, Omar's voice dropped to a whisper that barely carried over the crackling flames. The materials weren't from Earth, Daniel. The molecular structure was all wrong, like they were built from elements that don't exist in our periodic table. He looked directly at me then, and I saw in his eyes the reflection of truths that had been eating at him for 5 years. That thing in the Atlantic didn't crash. It came home. After sleeping in trenches deeper than our deepest nightmares, it woke up and came home to find squatters had moved into the house. As if summoned by his words, a deep booming pulse echoed across the landscape from the east. The sound bypassed our ears entirely, vibrating through the ground and into our bones with the rhythmic precision of a heart the size of continents. Every refugee in the camp looked up simultaneously, their faces painted with the primal terror of prey animals who'd just heard the footsteps of something vast and hungry. The pulse came again, stronger this time, shaking loose teeth and stopping wristwatches, and with each cosmic heartbeat, the storms grew more powerful, more coordinated, more obviously directed by intelligence beyond human comprehension. Our journey west became a tour through the circles of a uniquely American hell. In Ohio, we drove through Columbus as the floodwaters reached the 4th floors of downtown buildings. Traffic lights blinked beneath the murky surface like drowned stars, while bodies floated past our convoy with the gentle motion of leaves on a poisoned pond. The children on Elena's bus had grown quiet as the weight of what they were witnessing settled into their developing minds. Some of the older kids asked questions that shattered hearts. Why was this happening? Where were their parents? When could they go home to feed their pets? Home. The word had become meaningless somewhere between Baltimore and the endless refugee camps that stretched across the Midwest like lesions on the face of the continent. In Indiana, we encountered our first human predators. A group of armed men had taken control of a bridge crossing the Wabash River, demanding food and fuel from refugees in exchange for safe passage. Their leader was a scarecrow of a man with hollow eyes and a hunting rifle he held like a religious artifact. "You can go around if you don't like our toll," he said, gesturing towards the flooded landscape. Of course, the bridge 20 miles north collapsed yesterday, and the one 20 miles south is controlled by folks with less generous dispositions than us. Luther studied the man for a long moment, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Then he put the truck in gear and drove straight at the barricade, scattering our men like bowling pins as 18 wheels of Detroit steel demolished their checkpoint. "Some bridges you negotiate," Luther said calmly as we crossed into Illinois. "Others you just drive through." But it was Chicago that showed us how the old world would make its final stand. The Windy City had built a wall. Not just a sea wall or flood barrier, but a fortress of concrete and steel that surrounded the entire metropolitan area like the ramparts of some medieval castle. For 72 hours, the wall held against waves that hammered it with the force of liquid mountains, each impact sending tremors through the earth that we could feel from 50 miles away. I watched the siege through binoculars from a hill in western Illinois, mesmerized by the sight of a great American city making its last desperate stand against an ocean gone mad with alien purpose. The waves didn't attack randomly. They probed the wall's defenses, tested for weaknesses, retreated to gather strength before returning with surgical strikes against specific vulnerabilities. The wall fell on a Tuesday morning in a coordinated assault that lasted 6 hours, not all at once but section by section, as the alien sea found each structural flaw and exploited it with the patience of something that could wait millennia for the perfect moment to strike. When it was over, Lake Michigan had become an inland sea that stretched beyond the horizon, with no trace remaining of the city that had once stood on its shores. 9 million people, erased as thoroughly as pencil marks from paper. We reached the Nebraska border on a Wednesday, joining a river of humanity that flowed west like blood from a mortal wound. The state's population had exploded from 2 million to over 30 million in less than a week, turning the Great Plains into the world's largest refugee camp. Tent cities sprawled across the landscape like cancerous growths, military surplus shelters mixing with lean-tos built from car doors and highway signs. FEMA trailers sat beside improvised shacks constructed from shopping carts and billboard advertisements. It was a metropolis of desperation, a city built from the skeletal remains of American civilization. Food riots erupted every few hours as distribution systems collapsed under the sheer weight of starving humanity. I watched neighbors turn on each other over cans of beans. Families fragment over arguments about sleeping space in overcrowded tents. Children cry for parents who would never answer because they were floating face down in what used to be Kansas. From the highest hills in central Nebraska, the view in every direction revealed the same horrifying truth. Black water stretching to infinity. An alien ocean that had swallowed the edges of the world. We were on an island now, perhaps the last island, surrounded by water that pulsed with its own malevolent intelligence. The alien sea wasn't empty. Vast shapes moved beneath its surface, creatures or structures that displaced millions of tons of water as they glided through the depths with purpose we couldn't fathom. Survivors reported glimpses of spires rising from the flood, architecture that followed no earthly principles, buildings that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes could process. On Thursday night, Omar vanished. I found his abandoned campsite the next morning, belongings scattered as if he'd left in desperate haste. But there were no footprints leading away from his tent, no signs of struggle, no indication of where he'd gone or what had taken him. It was Luther who discovered the message, carved into the bark of a dead tree 50 yards from the camp. In letters that looked burned rather than cut. They're calling me home. The water remembers my voice from the deep places. Tell them I'm sorry we took so long to leave. That same night, the waterspouts began their hunt. They rose from the flooded plains like the fingers of drowned gods reaching for heaven, massive columns of spinning water that moved with obvious intelligence, a murderous intent. The first one carved a surgical path through what had been Kansas, moving in a perfectly straight line towards the Nebraska refugee camps. Through binoculars, I watched the tornado approach Interstate 80, systematically destroying every bridge, overpass, and potential escape route that might allow people to flee further west. This wasn't the random destruction of natural weather. This was military strategy executed with the precision of a general who'd studied human psychology for geological ages. More waterspouts formed throughout the day, each one targeting population centers with surgical accuracy. Omaha, Lincoln, Grand Island, every city in Nebraska struck by perfectly placed tornadoes that left nothing but churning water and debris arranged in patterns that almost resembled letters in an alphabet designed by madmen. "It's herding us," Elena whispered, her arms wrapped protectively around a cluster of terrified children. "Like sheep being driven into a pen. It wants us all in one place for something." She was absolutely right. Every storm, every flood, every meteorological weapon was designed to funnel survivors towards a specific location. Not to kill us immediately, but to gather us together for some ritual or harvest that our species was too young to understand. The children Elena protected had begun to change in ways that defied rational explanation. Not physically, but mentally. as if prolonged exposure to the alien water was awakening parts of their brains that evolution had kept dormant. They spoke of dreams where they breathed liquid instead of air, where they swam through vast underwater cities where voices older than continents called to them in languages that predated human speech. "The water wants us to come home," 8-year-old Timothy told me one morning, his young eyes reflecting depth that no child should contain. "It's been so lonely waiting for us to remember how to breathe properly." 10-year-old Sarah Chen drew pictures with crayons salvaged from the ruins of her school, but her artwork showed things no child should know how to imagine. Spiraling cities that existed in impossible geometries, creatures that seemed to be built from mathematics and starlight, symbols that hurt to look at for more than a few seconds. "This is where we lived before," she explained matter-of-factly, showing me a drawing of underwater spires that stretched impossibly tall, "before we forgot how to swim in the deep places. The water is just helping us remember." On Friday night, the sky turned the colour of deep ocean water, a blue-green that seemed to emanate from the alien sea itself and reflect off the storm clouds until the entire dome of heaven glowed like the inside of a vast aquarium. Children throughout the camp began crying simultaneously, their tears glowing with the same bioluminescent light that pulsed in the flood waters. Adults prayed to gods who seemed to have abandoned Earth entirely, while dogs howled in harmonies that sounded almost like music, as if they were trying to sing along with frequencies only they could hear. Then, for the first time since the crash, the alien vessel began its full emergence. Even from 1,000 miles away, we could see it rising like a mountain being born in fast forward. A structure so vast that it challenged the very concept of size, stretching from the ocean floor through the clouds and beyond into the stratosphere. It wasn't a ship in any sense that human engineering could comprehend. It was a city, a monument, a statement written in architecture that dwarfed pyramids and skyscrapers and every other attempt our species had made to touch the sky. As it rose, smaller structures became visible around its base, though smaller was relative when dealing with buildings the size of mountain ranges. They looked grown rather than built, organic curves and impossible angles that seemed to shift and flow when observed directly, as if they existed partially in dimensions that human eyes couldn't properly focus on. Lightning began dancing across the sky in patterns too precise to be natural. Great arcs of electricity connecting the storm clouds in a web of crackling communication. The very atmosphere became a canvas for something trying to speak across the vast gulf between species, though the message was clear enough without translation. The storm clouds themselves took on structure, forming symbols that reminded me of Sanskrit or hieroglyphics, but infinitely more complex and beautiful and terrible. The entire sky became a scroll being written by entities whose thoughts moved at the speed of hurricanes. As the vessel completed its emergence, reports flooded in from the few surviving communication networks around the globe. Identical structures were rising from every major ocean trench on the planet. The Mariana Trench in the Pacific, the Puerto Rico Trench in the Atlantic, the Java Trench in the Indian Ocean, the Arctic Ocean beneath the polar ice cap that was already melting from the heat of awakening gods. Each vessel awakened storms that made our Atlantic hurricane system look like a gentle spring shower. Tsunamis taller than the Himalayas scoured the coastlines of Asia, carrying away entire nations in single waves. Cyclones the size of continents spun over the Pacific, their winds strong enough to strip islands down to bare volcanic rock. Polar storms turned the Arctic Ocean into a cauldron of ice and fury that flash froze everything within a 1,000-mile radius. The Earth was being systematically sterilized, scrubbed clean by its rightful owners, who had finally awakened from dreams that lasted longer than human history. I understood then, with a clarity that cut through me like lightning made of ice water. This wasn't an invasion or first contact between two species discovering each other for the first time. This was a foreclosure proceeding. Humanity had been squatting on property that belonged to someone else, and now the landlords had returned to evict us from their ancestral home. The oceans had always been theirs. Every drop of water on the planet, from the vast Pacific to the smallest mountain stream, was part of a global organism that had been dreaming in the depths while we built our temporary civilizations on the islands of dry land they'd allowed to remain above their domain. But now they were awake, and the lease had expired with the finality of geological time. Saturday brought the final gathering. The alien sea reached our camp not as a violent flood, but as a rising tide that seemed almost gentle in its inevitability. Dark, warm water that pulsed with bioluminescent lights and carried within it the chemical taste of transformation. Some refugees fled to the few remaining hills, clinging to the last pieces of dry land, like children hiding under blankets. Others walked into the water willingly, their faces serene with acceptance or madness, or perhaps a wisdom that came from finally understanding humanity's true place in the cosmic order. Luther remained in his truck cab even as the water rose, around the wheels, then the doors, then the windows. 30 years driving these roads, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the liquid medium that had replaced breathable air. Never imagined they'd all become ocean floor, but every journey ends somewhere, even if it's somewhere we never expected to arrive. Elena gathered her 37 children on the highest hill she could find, singing lullabies in a dozen languages while the alien tide lapped at their feet. Some of the kids had stopped being afraid. They watched the approaching water with the acceptance that only children could manage, trusting that the adults would somehow transform this ending into something beautiful. But there would be no miracle salvation, no last-minute rescue, no scientific breakthrough that would turn back the alien tide. There would be only the water, rising with patient inevitability, to reclaim a world that had never truly belonged to us. I was among the last to be claimed, standing on a mound of debris that had once been someone's house, watching the dark water lap at my feet, while the alien city dominated the eastern horizon like a mountain made of dreams and mathematics. The structure pulsed with lights that had been waiting millions of years to shine again, sending signals to sister cities rising from trenches around the globe. In my final moments above the surface, I understood something that perhaps only a hydrologist could fully appreciate. Water always finds its level. It flows around obstacles, wears down resistance, and eventually claims every space it can reach. Our entire history as a species had been spent trying to control water, to channel it and dam it and hold it back from where it wanted to go. But you can't fight water forever. It always wins in the end, because it has time on its side, and patience that outlasts civilizations. The alien sea was warm when it finally closed over my head. Warmer than any earthly ocean, filled with currents that carried whispers of vast intelligence and patient purpose that stretched back to the formation of the solar system. As I sank beneath the surface, I saw lights in the depths, cities of impossible beauty, extending down into abyssal trenches where pressure should have crushed any structure into component atoms. I should have drowned within minutes, should have suffocated as my lungs filled with alien water and my brain shut down from oxygen deprivation. Instead, something fundamental changed in my cellular structure, some adaptation that allowed me to process the liquid around me as easily as breathing air. The water tasted of ancient minerals and distant stars, of time so vast that human consciousness couldn't encompass its true scope. And I heard them. Not voices in any language humans had ever developed, but communications that bypassed auditory processing entirely and spoke directly to whatever part of my brain handled meaning and memory. They weren't angry or cruel, these alien intelligences. They weren't even particularly interested in humanity's extinction. We'd simply been in the way, a temporary infestation that had finally been cleaned up by the property's rightful owners. They told me stories as I drifted through underwater cities that spanned continents, tales of civilizations that had risen and fallen, while Earth was still a molten ball of rock and gas. They showed me galaxies where water-based consciousness had evolved in the spaces between stars, where thoughts moved at the speed of tides and individual identity was as foreign a concept as breathing liquid had once been to human lungs. I learned that Earth had never been alone, never been unique. It was simply one node in a vast network of water worlds, connected by currents that flowed not through space but through dimensions that physics was only beginning to suspect. The oceans of a million planets, all part of a single consciousness that thought in epochs and dreamed in the formation and destruction of solar systems. We had been allowed to evolve as an experiment, a curiosity, a brief flowering of air-breathing intelligence on the temporary islands of dry land. But experiments end, and the laboratory must be cleaned for the next phase of research. I've been floating in this endless sea for what feels like centuries now, carried by currents that flow according to alien logic through cities that exist in more dimensions than human geometry could map. Sometimes I encounter other humans transformed like me, adapted for this new world that was always more theirs than ours. We don't speak, because language was a tool for creatures who lived in air and built their civilizations on solid ground. The surface world is gone, not destroyed but transformed into something that serves the needs of intelligences, vast and ancient, and utterly indifferent to what we once called human achievement. The storms that drowned our species were just housekeeping, the way someone might clean algae from an aquarium before introducing new fish. Sometimes I rise toward the surface and look up through miles of dark water at stars that have been rearranged into new constellations, patterns that suggest this world is broadcasting its awakening to distant cousins among the galaxies. Earth has rejoined whatever community it belonged to before life crawled out of the seas and began the long, futile journey toward agriculture and cities and the illusion of permanent significance. But I remember everything now, with a clarity that human memory never possessed. I remember Daniel Karr of Baltimore, Maryland, who loved his daughter and understood the movement of water and died trying to call her on her 28th birthday. I remember the sound of Emma's laughter and the taste of morning coffee and the way sunlight looked when it fell through office windows onto flood preparedness reports that couldn't prepare anyone for what really mattered. I remember the storm that wasn't ending, but only beginning. The storm that washed away every trace of the world we thought we owned, leaving only the eternal ocean, and whatever dreams the water dreams in the crushing depths where pressure transforms carbon into diamonds, and time moves at the pace of geological change. The storm wasn't ending. It was only beginning. And now that it's swept the world clean, now that the rightful owners have reclaimed their inheritance from the brief infestation that called itself humanity, perhaps it's finally time for the next phase of the experiment to begin. But I don't think it will be anything we would recognize as life. I think it will be something altogether more beautiful, and far more terrible than anything our air-breathing minds could ever imagine. The water remembers everything, and now so do I.